How many of you have had to throw out table salt because it lost its flavor, lost its saltiness? Anybody? Never? Never happened to you? Okay. We're going to read Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, and then Luke 14, 34, and 35. If you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. Luke 14. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is neither fit for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Now there are a few questions that beg to be answered when you read these two side by side. Now, keep in mind it's the same teaching, but the two people are using different ways of expressing the same thing. Now both passages use the word alles, which translators have decided to interpret salt. And the problem is that if Jesus meant table salt or sodium chloride, there are some things that don't make sense here. Remember, most Bible commentators say that salt signifies preservation and flavor enhancement. So why would Jesus want to preserve what was already there? That would have seemed like nonsense to the Jews. The socio-political scene at the time wasn't exactly a rosy picture for the Jews. They were dominated by Rome. They were brutally oppressed. And their hope was in a Messiah who would rescue them from their harsh oppressors. And so the outlook for the Jews was anything but peaceful. The religious system was rotten to the core as well. And the scribes and the Pharisees took advantage of the average person, both Jew and Gentile, laying heavy weights on their shoulders, and they weren't, and Jesus said, you aren't even willing to lift a finger to help them. You weigh these heavy burdens on people, and you don't lift a finger to help them. So why would Jesus want to preserve something like this? And if you remember on Palm Sunday, Brando preached about Jesus clearing the temple. He wasn't saying, oh, this is really nice, let's just preserve this. He overthrew the tables of the money changers. There's something that Jesus was wanting to do. Here's what Dr. Pierre Gilbert said. Jesus had come to provide a new understanding of God, not just to repeat the old. In fact, the freshness of his teaching is what attracted a lot of people to him. He didn't sound dusty like the Pharisees. Jesus was like a warm spring day after a long and harsh winter. The idea of preservation does not work well. Another question. Why does Luke make reference to the manure pile? So if alles is sodium chloride or table salt, it's a very peculiar thing to say. Now, I've worked on ranches for years. When I was young, I worked on a couple different ranches. And city folk, to city folk, the thought of manure is sort of nauseating and disgusting. But to a rancher, to a farmer, it's life. They love manure. I know that's weird, but it's life to them. The farmers would take this commodity. They would collect, if you can believe it, they collect manure all year long. And then they spread it in their fields, and it gives life to the plants. It produces growth. Now, why would Jesus associate table salt and manure? Jesus said in verse 35 that this substance, halas, is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. Why would table salt be good for the manure pile? And even more peculiar is his comment that it's of no use for the soil if it loses its saltiness or its flavor. That just doesn't make any sense. No farmer in his right mind would add salt to his precious manure. The salt would counteract the good that the manure was meant for. Now, I asked you at the beginning how many of you are gardeners and how many of you spread salt on your garden, and you're all very smart, and you said, no, we don't do any because it's death for the soil. Here's another question about salt. Both passages pose the question, if salt loses its saltiness or flavor, how can it be restored? At this point, I'm going to call Dave Burgoyne up. Now, Dave has a PhD in organic chemistry, And so he's the right guy to call up and talk about this. And I'm just going to ask you one simple question. We want a simple answer, Dave. Can salt lose its saltiness?
No. Sodium chloride is chemistry 101. Sodium chloride actually exists as Na plus and Cl minus. And sodium itself, it's a positive charge in that form, right? It's really stable. It's a really stable form. What happens? Actually, you can get sodium, and it's really cool. Actually, you get sodium in a metal. Sodium actually exists when it's neutral in a metal, and it actually has an electron on its outer valence shell, and it wants to lose that quickly. So if you put it in water, it'll violently react, and it'll violently react to get to sodium that is in sodium chloride, Na+. Similarly, chlorine, you've heard chlorine gas, right? Chlorine exists as a poisonous gas. Mm-hmm. It has 7 electrons in its valence shell. It wants 8, because 8 is the perfect octet. And so,
Dave,
yeah.
I said simple.
It's stable.
There's some people who are really enjoying this. How many are enjoying this? Yeah, carry on.
Well, it's when they exist, when you get it, sodium plus and Cl minus, they both exist in a very stable form. Mm-hmm. They bond together ionically, and they don't change. It doesn't change. It shouldn't lose its saltiness because sodium chloride is very stable.
Great answer. Is that good? So, does salt lose its saltiness?
No.
Thank you. That's all I wanted. So why would Jesus say if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's a very curious thing to say because salt does not lose its saltiness. You can keep your salt in your cupboard for 1,000 years, if you live that long, and it would still be salty. Another question. Why does Matthew use earth, which most commentators interpret to mean society, and Luke used soil in verse 34? When you put both of these verses side by side, there's some questions that beg to be answered. Now, if you read Matthew all by itself, it makes sense, but when you put it alongside Luke, there's some things that seem incongruent. It doesn't make sense. And the easiest thing for us to do is just stick with what is easy and ignore what seems to be, at first glance, a contradiction. But when we start to ask some of these questions, the pieces of this baffling puzzle start falling into place. So let's try and make sense of this. So like I said earlier, the Greek word allos, which is translated salt here, also means chemical or mineral. Now here's where things start getting interesting. Because in the Dead Sea in Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his time in the northern part of Israel, in Galilee, the Dead Sea is full of chemicals like phosphates and potash and gypsum and magnesium sulfate, or what we call Epsom salts. How many of you use Epsom salts in your bath? Yes, it's beautiful. And as a matter of fact, on the back of some Epsom salt labels, it tells you how to use it for your garden. Now, one of the most common things that the minerals in the Dead Sea are used for is fertilizer. And farmers would take these rich fertilizer minerals and they mix them with their manure, and then they'd spread them on their fields so that their crops would be vitalized. The word that we translate to lose taste or lose saltiness, depending on your translation, as I said, is the Greek word moreno. And this can also be translated to lose effectiveness. So if we're talking about fertilizer or manure, it wouldn't make sense that Jesus would say it would lose its taste. That's an unpleasant thought. And so, what's Jesus saying here? This is what he's saying. You are the fertilizer of the earth. You are the fertilizer of the soil. You are the fertilizer of society. So fertilizer gives life to what is dormant. It stimulates growth. Jesus is not saying that we are just here to preserve what's already here or to add flavor to it or to put up with the status quo. The message of Jesus is revolutionary. It's life-changing. And he's saying that our call is to bring life to what was dead or dormant. to bring hope to people who have lost their way, to stimulate growth in those who have given up hope and think that there's no reason for living. That's our mission, friends. We are the fertilizer of the earth, of society, bringing the message of the gospel, the hope of the gospel that gives life where there's death.